Across the ravaged landscapes of Europe, the Third Reich's own hubris brought about its undoing. On the frigid Eastern Front, soldiers were frozen stiff in their defensive positions, their eyes glazed over in death before the sun could even rise. Entire platoons were decimated by starvation. Lice transitioned from the fallen to the living, as if no distinction existed. A single morsel of bread was considered an immense treasure. The din of gunfire had faded into the background, becoming mere ambient noise. The true killer was the biting cold. It was a winter so severe that it stripped men of everything but the primal urge to survive, even if that meant laying down their arms. And for countless German soldiers, the act of surrender would be to the Americans, not the Soviets. Their westward exodus commenced in a state of profound dread. Those who had witnessed the retribution exacted by the Soviets spoke in hushed tones of detention centers from which no one ever returned. Whispers circulated of prisoner columns perishing in the snowdrifts, of guards who would shoot for sheer sport. Better the Americans, some grumbled. Yet none truly understood what that would entail. When they finally relinquished their firearms in the decaying urban centers of North Africa or amidst the olive groves of Italy, the war concluded not with triumphant cheers, but with the muted click of safety catches and the pervasive scent of dust and diesel. They were crammed into trucks, then onto ships, packed so densely that even the sea air seemed thick with the smell of men and despair. Days at sea devolved into a monotonous cycle of clanging metal and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull. The guards stood impassively, their rifles slung, rarely raising them. One detainee, who had once worked as a mechanic in Bremen, later recounted that the drone of the ship's engines was the first soothing sound he had heard since the year 1939. They traversed the Atlantic under the vigilant gaze of the United States Navy, the very force they had been indoctrinated to oppose. As the coastline finally materialized, a faint azure line against a sky the color of burnished copper, many of them wept, though the reason eluded them. Perhaps it was the sight of land that had not been reduced to rubble. After weeks spent traversing the country by rail through Texas and New Mexico, the train halted in the desert expanse near Phoenix, Arizona. It was December, yet the air was pleasantly warm and carried a subtle fragrance of orange blossoms. The sand shimmered like powdered gold beneath a sky so intensely bright it made the men squint. "America," someone murmured, as if invoking a distant planet. The guards gestured for them to disembark. There was no shouting, no bayonets prodding their ribs. Instead, they were handed metal cups filled with water so frigid it stung their throats. The prisoners drank it down with fervent haste, the water cascading down their bearded faces, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and sheer disbelief. Before them lay Camp Papago Park. It was an expansive compound, featuring neat rows of low-slung wooden barracks, whitewashed fencing, and even a small chapel and a baseball field situated beyond the perimeter wire. Palm trees swayed gracefully where one might have expected to see guard towers casting imposing shadows. The desert air was still, the quiet broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant clatter of typewriters. "This cannot possibly be a place of confinement," one soldier mused aloud. "It resembles a holiday resort." 4 men who had endured the desolation of Stalingrad's ruins found the locale almost ethereal. Within each barrack were tiered bunks equipped with mattresses, sheets, and even electric lighting. A mess hall served hearty stews brimming with meat, prepared by cooks in pristine white aprons. Some of the prisoners ate slowly, their suspicion piqued by the unfamiliar flavors, anticipating some sort of deception. One officer, his face pale and his hands trembling, made the sign of the cross before taking his first bite. "It's genuine," another whispered softly. "They are feeding us." The guards, predominantly young American servicemen, appeared almost nonchalant, some engaged in laughter, others leaning against fence posts with mugs of coffee in hand. They communicated in slow, deliberate English, occasionally interspersed with broken German, inquiring about names and offering cigarettes. The prisoners found themselves at a loss as to how to respond. They had been led to believe that Americans were monstrous beings, a nation comprised of crude barbarians and cowards. Yet here they were, treated not as animals, but as human beings. The experience was profoundly disorienting, even deeply humbling. As night fell, the desert air grew sharply colder. The prisoners lay awake, swaddled in wool blankets, listening to the low hum of the electric lights and the distant wail of a radio emanating from the guardhouse. For the first time in years, the terrifying sound of artillery was absent. No anguished screams pierced the darkness. A peculiar sense of calm permeated the atmosphere. Some men wept silently, others gazed at the ceiling, as if expecting the surreal scene to dissolve at any moment. A sergeant from Hamburg murmured, "If my wife could witness my current state, warm, well-fed and alive, she would undoubtedly believe I had ascended to paradise." The following morning, they were provided with soap, razors, and new uniforms bearing the designation PW. The showers offered steaming hot water, the vapor curling through the wooden partitions. The sound of genuine laughter, a sound unheard since their captivity began, echoed through the camp. One man held his hand beneath the flow of running water and softly remarked, "We never even had this level of comfort back home." The American approach was remarkably straightforward. Treat them with dignity, expose them to democratic principles, and win their allegiance without resorting to force. It was a strategic objective cloaked in benevolence. Nevertheless, a sense of order was maintained. Morning roll calls were conducted, lights were extinguished by 9 o'clock, and venturing beyond the perimeter fence was strictly prohibited. However, within these established boundaries, life unfolded with an unexpected richness. Some men engaged in games of chess or soccer. Others meticulously crafted miniature ships from salvaged timber. A select group of former engineers devised small windmills to harness the desert breeze. And in the evenings, they would gather near the wire, observing the sky transform into a fiery crimson canvas above the Arizona hills. "It's too breathtaking," one observed wistfully. "It feels wrong to experience happiness here." Correspondence from home began to arrive via the Red Cross. Some letters conveyed the reassuring news of families remaining alive. Others confirmed tragic losses. Those who had served on the Eastern Front remained notably reticent. They had witnessed horrors that rendered beauty almost unbearable. A gaunt man named Keller, who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite near Kursk, spent considerable time sketching the camp's environs, capturing the palms, the barracks, and the smiling faces of the guards. "No one in Germany will ever believe this," he stated, as if offering it as irrefutable proof. One afternoon, an American captain gathered a few of the men near the fence and gestured towards the distant city skyline. "That's Phoenix," he informed them. "You can see it if you climb the tower." He let out a soft chuckle. "Don't get any ideas." But, as was inevitable, ideas had already begun to germinate. Despite its outward appearance of tranquility, Papago Park remained a correctional facility. The concept of liberty shimmered just beyond the enclosing wire, as tantalizingly golden and elusive as the distant horizon. That night, under the ethereal glow of the desert moon, a contingent of naval officers convened in their barrack, their voices a low murmur of hushed conversation. They had once been U-boat personnel, proud of their discipline and their strategic acumen. One of them traced a line in the sand with a stick, delineating the camp's perimeter, followed by another curved line beneath it. "It is achievable," he declared. "If we excavate in this vicinity," the others exchanged glances around the dimly lit interior, noting the bunk beds, the electric lamp, and the soothing hum of a radio playing American swing music. Outside, the guards were animatedly discussing baseball scores. The air was imbued with the comforting scents of soap and freshly baked bread from the kitchen. By all outward appearances, it was a sanctuary, yet, in the eyes of these men, this sanctuary had transformed into an intellectual challenge. As the lights dimmed, Keller peered out through the barred window at the vast expanse of the desert and whispered to himself, "A heavenly place indeed, but even angels might yearn for flight." The desert possessed its own inherent cadence, a rhythm that even those held captive could eventually discern. By early 1945, the inhabitants of Camp Papago had become accustomed to a way of life that, by every conceivable measure, felt utterly surreal. The morning bugle would sound, followed by roll call and a breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, preceding work details under a sun that intensified the sand to a blazing white. At midday, the heat shimmered so intensely that even the observation towers appeared to waver like mirages. The men learned to move with deliberate slowness, conserving their perspiration as if it were precious currency. "We are indeed prisoners," one quipped, "but at least the guards are courteous." It was a peculiar form of confinement, devoid of overt brutality, hunger, and remarkably, almost entirely free of animosity. The Americans managed the facility with quiet competence. Rules were indeed in place. No attempts at escape, no violence, no political discourse, but they were enforced with a gentle firmness rather than punitive measures. When an individual was apprehended hoarding bread, the guard did not resort to physical reprimand. Instead, he inquired kindly, "You don't need to do that here, friend. There will be more tomorrow." The German detainee froze, uncertain whether to feel affronted or profoundly grateful. It was a form of compassion that evoked more bewilderment than solace. Each prisoner was assigned minor responsibilities. Kitchen duties, latrine cleaning, and grounds maintenance were standard tasks. The officers, naturally, were excused from such labor, their ingrained habits of command persisting even within the confines of the camp. A few individuals, including Keller, the artist, volunteered for external work crews, participating in cotton harvesting and repairing irrigation channels under the relentless Arizona sun. They were compensated with canteen vouchers, small metal tokens redeemable for chocolate, cigarettes, or Coca-Cola. The first time Keller tasted the dark, effervescent sweetness, he coughed and then erupted into laughter simultaneously. "It tastes like liberation," he declared. The Americans actively encouraged recreational activities. Soccer matches transformed the parade ground into a chaotic spectacle of swirling dust and boisterous laughter. Art classes were offered, lectures on the English language were conducted, and a camp orchestra, assembled from scavenged instruments, even performed Sunday concerts. Some of the guards participated in these activities. One corporal, named Jim, patiently explained the intricacies of baseball to them, shouting encouragement from the sidelines as the Germans swung clumsily at the ball, their boots slipping in the soft sand. "Strike two!" he would bellow, a wide grin on his face. "You swing like a politician!" Even the officers allowed themselves a moment of amusement. The rigid distinctions of rank dissolved, supplanted by something far simpler, a shared experience of exhaustion and mirth beneath an accommodating sky. However, not everyone found it easy to adapt. Captain Wattenberg, the former U-boat commander, maintained an air of stiff dignity, a man still at war. He kept his uniform impeccably pressed, his posture rigid, his disdain subtly expressed but keenly felt. "This is no paradise," he warned those who were becoming overly comfortable. "It is a gilded cage. Never forget who you are. Soldiers of the Reich." His pronouncements weighed heavily on the younger men, who harbored a desire to cast off their former identities. Yet his authority persisted, forged from discipline and enduring memory. In the evenings, as the powerful floodlights illuminated the grounds and the desert air cooled, the prisoners would congregate in small clusters outside their barracks. Some would sing old melodies, their voices carrying softly across the sands. Others would smoke in contemplative silence, their gazes fixed on the distant mountains. The stars above were impossibly brilliant, the kind of celestial display that had become a rarity in Europe. Beneath that boundless firmament, the men felt simultaneously insignificant and profoundly secure. The war seemed a distant echo. Radio broadcasts spoke of bombed cities, of utter defeat, of unconditional surrender. But here, time appeared to have momentarily halted. It was a respite that carried a faint, unsettling taste of guilt. Letters from home, when they arrived, reinserted the war into their lives through written words. "Berlin burns," one man read aloud, his voice laced with disbelief. Another, trembling, learned that his wife had remarried. Some letters arrived from mothers who still harbored the unwavering belief that their sons were fighting valiantly for the fatherland. They concluded with phrases like, "for victory." The men carefully folded these missives and tucked them beneath their pillows, unwilling to acknowledge that victory now equated to an American dinner menu featuring meat twice a week. The guards seemed to grasp the peculiar sense of pride harbored by their charges. They rarely taunted, never lectured. Instead, they allowed the stark contrast between their worlds to speak for itself. The prisoners were shown films in the recreation hall featuring Frank Capra comedies, musical shorts, and even It's a Wonderful Life. For many Germans, this provided their initial glimpse of American cities alive and undamaged, of people laughing freely in public venues. Following one such screening, Keller murmured, "Their buildings still stand. Ours are dust." No one responded. One afternoon, the prisoners were granted permission to swim in the canal bordering the camp. The water was astonishingly cold, its surface shimmering under the intense sun. They dove, splashed, and shouted, momentarily forgetting the confining wire for a brief, glorious hour. An American sergeant leaned against the fence, observing them with a smile. "You fellas look like kids," he commented good-naturedly. "Don't drown. I've got paperwork if you do." When the whistle blew, signaling their return, some hesitated. The desert wind rustled through the palm fronds as if whispering, "Freedom is merely a few steps further." That evening, Wattenberg convened his most trusted men, naval officers characterized by their discipline and unwavering loyalty. They met discreetly in a corner of the barrack, feigning engagement in card games. "We cannot languish here while the fatherland bleeds," he declared. "We will remind them that the German spirit remains unbroken." He outlined a plan, one that had been gradually taking shape since their initial night of arrival. An escape through a subterranean passage painstakingly excavated beneath the desert. His tone was measured, almost reverent, as if describing a sacred ritual. "The Americans believe their kindness will subdue us," he asserted. "They forget who we truly are." Keller, overhearing this, felt a peculiar internal conflict arise. He admired the captain's unwavering conviction, yet a part of him questioned the true meaning of loyalty when the war had unequivocally been lost. The camp had offered him solace, sustenance, and the renewed ability to pursue his art. Nevertheless, the siren call of freedom burned within every man like a persistent ember. Could he reconcile himself to comfort while his conscience whispered the accusation of betrayal? Days drifted by, the idyllic rhythm of camp life continuing unabated. Chores were performed, laughter was shared, letters were exchanged, and games were played. Yet, beneath the surface of this apparent tranquility, the ground was subtly shifting. Whispers circulated regarding measurements, the procurement of secret wooden supports, and maps sketched with soap. Even those among the most content felt an escalating tension, like static electricity building in the air. One evening, a guard ambled past, humming a tune, and Keller flinched, his thoughts consumed by the clandestine tunnel he now helped to conceal. Guilt had supplanted hunger as the camp's new tormentor. By spring, the men moved with the practiced grace of actors on a stage, their smiles masking their inner turmoil, their games and conversations a pretense of forgetting. But in the quiet of the night, when the wind carried the scent of impending rain and the pervasive aroma of sand, Keller would cast his gaze toward the far corner of the compound. The ground there appeared no different from any other part of the grounds. Yet, beneath its unassuming surface, men toiled in silence, meticulously excavating their gilded prison. Life within Camp Papago had imparted a series of bewildering lessons, teaching them that acts of mercy could feel like mockery and that peace could inflict a sharper sting than overt pain. Each sunrise that dawned over the Arizona desert brought with it an equal measure of comfort and disquiet. And as the days grew longer, Keller began to perceive that the true conflict no longer raged in the distant theaters of war in Europe, but rather here, within the silent, internal battle between profound gratitude and unyielding pride. One night, when the guards extinguished the floodlights earlier than usual, the camp descended into an uncharacteristic darkness. Keller looked up at the inky sky and felt an inexplicable tightness in his chest. The stars had never appeared so close, so tangible. Somewhere beneath his feet, Wattenberg's men were diligently digging their way towards them. He whispered the word that had haunted him since his very first day in America: Freiheit. And for the first time, he found himself uncertain whether it signified salvation or the harbinger of their ultimate downfall. The winter of 1944 arrived with an uncharacteristic gentleness upon Arizona. The desert, typically an inferno, transformed into a landscape of biting cold and sharp clarity under a sky painted in shades of silver. At dawn, a delicate crust of frost adorned the camp fences, and the wind carried the subtle scent of föhn from distant horizons. Beneath this superficial quiet, deep within the earth itself, another kind of atmosphere was taking shape, one characterized by meticulous calculation, pervasive secrecy, and an unyielding pride. The excavation of the tunnel had commenced. It began as a hushed suggestion from Captain Wattenberg, his voice imbued with the authority of a man who refused to concede defeat even as the war had decisively turned against him. "The Reich may crumble," he confided to his assembled men in the dim, flickering light of the barrack, "but a soldier's spirit does not." His words resonated with a select few, drawing a small but dedicated circle of believers: naval officers, seasoned engineers, and a handful of restless souls who could no longer endure the suffocating stillness of their captivity. Among them was Keller, the quiet artist who had once harbored the hopeful notion that this idyllic setting could mend a broken spirit. Now, each act of kindness extended by their captors felt like a test he was consistently failing. The laborious digging began one moonless night in November. Concealed beneath a loose floorboard in the barracks washroom, the entrance to the subterranean passage lay hidden. They worked in shifts, 2 men at a time, one diligently shoveling, the other meticulously filling canvas sacks with the excavated earth. The tunnel itself was claustrophobically narrow, barely sufficient for a man to crawl through. The air within was stifling, thick with the cloying scent of sweat, damp earth, and the faint, almost sweet aroma of pine boards pilfered from the bunks. Their makeshift tools consisted of mess tins pressed into service as shovels, soup cans repurposed as lanterns, and lengths of string used to maintain their directional course. Every minuscule sound was magnified: the scrape of metal against soil, the groan of shifting earth. Above them, the muffled echo of guards' boots served as a constant percussive reminder of the ever-present risk. The excavated dirt was discreetly removed through a series of ingenious methods. They secreted it away in their pockets, discreetly discarded it amongst the meticulously maintained garden beds, or scattered it across the dusty surface of the camp's baseball field. Some men ingeniously stuffed sand into their trousers, shaking it loose gradually while walking, appearing like a stream of industrious ants in uniform. Keller's contribution involved drawing detailed sketches to meticulously document their progress, employing precise lines and angles that, to an untrained eye, appeared entirely innocuous. In the solitude of the night, he would pore over these drawings, gradually realizing that he had transformed into an architect of defiance. For several weeks, no one outside their clandestine circle harbored the slightest suspicion. The Americans, lulled into a false sense of security by the camp's pervasive tranquility, had grown complacent. Guards lounged lazily in their elevated posts, their laughter carried by the wind, oblivious to the clandestine activities unfolding beneath them. Some even absented themselves from their duties for opportune coffee breaks. It was, as one prisoner aptly observed, the perfect environment for imperfection. Yet, it was precisely this perceived perfection that bred carelessness. The tunnel extended inexorably, day by day. 60 feet, then 90, then 100. The men reinforced its precarious walls with scavenged bed slats, meticulously wrapping the joints in strips of cloth soaked in oil to dampen any creaking sounds. The excavation became a living entity, pulsing with the collective breath of those who toiled within its confines. "We are digging towards freedom," one whispered, his voice barely audible. "But it feels as though we are burrowing into the very heart of the earth." Keller found himself wrestling with his conscience. Each night, he would observe the guards engaged in their card games through the wire mesh, overhear the easy camaraderie and light-hearted laughter of men who no longer perceived them as adversaries. He recalled the invigorating hot showers, the unexpected kindness they had received on Thanksgiving Day, when they were served a festive turkey dinner. The thought of betraying such generosity gnawed at him. But then he would catch sight of Wattenberg's stern, proud, and unyielding countenance, and his lingering doubts would dissipate, dissolving into a quiet resolve of obedience. He was, after all, still a soldier. By the middle of December, the tunnel had reached its planned terminus, extending 178 feet, terminating beyond the confines of the fence line near a parched creek bed. The exit was artfully concealed beneath a patch of tumbleweed and a scattering of loose stones. When Wattenberg personally tested the passage, crawling through the oppressive darkness with only a flickering lantern for illumination, the air nearly suffocated him. However, as he emerged into the cool, crisp desert night, a low, guttural laugh escaped him, a sound that resonated with the unmistakable tone of triumph. "We are free men once more," he declared, brushing loose sand from his uniform. They selected Christmas Eve as the opportune moment for their escape. It was the one night they reasonably anticipated the guards would be preoccupied, their vigilance somewhat dulled by a combination of fatigue, festive spirit, and perhaps a touch of illicit coffee. In the mess hall, a Christmas tree, adorned with paper ornaments meticulously cut from ration boxes, glittered festively. The Americans had even distributed small tokens of appreciation, including soap, confectionery, and a few cigars. "Merry Christmas, boys!" one guard jovially exclaimed, his grin visible through the chain-link fence. The profound irony of the situation was not lost on any of the assembled men. That night, while the rest of the camp slept soundly under the gentle murmur of the desert wind, 25 men gathered in hushed silence within Barrack A. Each carried a small pack containing essentials: water, crackers, a compass, and a fragile scrap of hope. Keller's hands trembled imperceptibly as he tied the laces of his boots. The barrack clock chimed 11. Wattenberg offered a subtle nod, and one by one they crawled beneath the sink and vanished into the earth. The tunnel proved to be colder than they had anticipated, the air stale and damp. Each man carried a stub of a candle, its flame flickering precariously in the confined darkness. Their collective breaths echoed like the whispers of departed spirits. When the first man reached the tunnel's end, he pushed aside the concealing stones and tumbled out into the open night. The sky above was vast and star-strewn. The moon hung low over the desolate desert expanse. For a suspended moment, no one stirred. They simply gazed in silent awe at the boundless freedom that lay before them. Then, Wattenberg softly uttered the command, "Los!" and they dispersed into the desert in pairs, their direction set towards the south, towards Mexico. The loose sand crunched softly beneath their worn boots, and the air was infused with the sharp scent of sagebrush and the biting chill of the wind. They moved with haste, in profound silence, their hearts pounding with a heady mixture of exhilaration and primal fear. Behind them, Papago Park lay peacefully asleep, utterly unaware that its charges had vanished beneath its very foundations. But freedom, they would soon discover, proved to be a far more merciless mistress than captivity. The desert stretched out endlessly, a featureless, arid expanse. Their meager water supply dwindled to nothing by morning. The sun rose with the ferocity of a furnace, erasing their footprints as if they had never existed, while simultaneously scorching their exposed skin raw. Keller's small group stumbled upon an abandoned farmhouse by the second night, seeking refuge. Their hopes of finding sustenance were quickly dashed when they discovered the well was bone dry. He drank from a rusted tin, the taste of grit and sand overwhelming his palate. "We have exchanged paradise for perdition," one man lamented grimly. By the third day, the relentless exhaustion began to take its toll. Some surrendered to despair, waving down passing farmers for aid. Others attempted to follow the courses of dry creek beds, mistakenly believing they would lead them to the Mexican border. A lone individual was apprehended for pilfering sustenance from a fowl enclosure, and prior to yielding, he petitioned his captors for a beverage. The American forces, taken aback by this request, extended him griddle cakes as well. Wattenberg's contingent persevered the longest, remaining concealed by daylight and traveling under the veil of night. He bore himself like a spectral echo of his former command, guiding them through arid ravines and treacherous cacti. Yet, by the 8th day, even his resolve faltered. As they chanced upon a rural dwelling, its veranda illuminated by a lamp's glow, he turned to Keller and softly articulated, "We are soldiers, but even soldiers require clemency." They proceeded to the entrance and rapped. The farmer who appeared did not reach for any armament. He merely surveyed their weathered visages, exhaled a sigh, and stated, "You lads from Papago, supper is on the hearth." That evening, as the sentries escorted them back to the compound, the Americans were observed chuckling quietly, their heads shaking in disbelief. "You almost achieved it," one remarked. Wattenberg, seated in the truck's bed, gazed out at the desert scenery as it receded. This same desert he had once navigated underground was now bathed in brilliance beneath a full moon. Back within the perimeter, Keller stood near the tunnel's sealed egress, experiencing a blend of relief and mortification. Liberty had proven to be an illusion, and their perceived earthly paradise, it seemed, had never truly been lost. Nevertheless, as the camp's illumination flickered back to life, a singular notion remained persistent in his mind. If clemency could not shatter a soldier's spirit, perhaps it possessed the capacity to transform his heart. Spring arrived with a hushed grace upon the Arizona desert. The nights grew milder, and the wind lost its sting. Cacti burst into bloom in delicate hues of rose and gold beyond the barbed wire barriers, and the internees of Camp Papago resumed their established routines as if the audacious escape had been a fleeting fantasy consumed by the sands. The Americans repaired the ground where the subterranean passage had once emerged and subsequently cultivated a vegetable patch directly above it. The inherent irony was not lost on any of them. Freedom interred beneath a succession of carrots and legumes. There was no reprisal, not genuinely. The guards now recounted the incident with amusement, dubbing it the most courteous breakout in recorded history. The individuals who had absconded were returned, weary but unharmed, and following a few stern admonishments, they were permitted to return to their quarters. When an American officer posed the question to Captain Wattenberg as to his motivations, he offered a simple response: "Because I am a German officer." The captain's placid defiance appeared to amuse his interrogators more than it incensed them. One guard jested, "Next time inform us in advance. We'll prepare you a repast." Wattenberg maintained his composure, but Keller, standing discreetly behind him, permitted himself a quiet smile. Something shifted within the compound subsequent to that event. The men's sense of pride remained intact, but their unshakable conviction had dissipated. They began to perceive the guards differently, not as adversaries, but as fellow human beings, clad in contrasting uniforms. The Americans, too, exhibited a noticeable softening. Regulations were still enforced, but now they were imbued with a sense of understanding. When the prisoners engaged in labor in the fields or undertook the cleaning of the barracks, they were provided with chilled lemonade rather than directives barked through a loudspeaker. Even the fencing felt less like confinement and more like a reminder that the conflict, in all its senselessness, possessed discernible boundaries. The desert transformed into their educational space. Keller frequently ambled along the inner perimeter at dusk, a sketchpad in his grasp, capturing the watchtowers, the palm trees, and the countenances of men who had once believed the world concluded at the boundary. He commenced sketching the Americans as well, one individual in particular, a guard named Jim, who consistently whistled during his patrols. Jim once discovered him sketching and inquired, "Am I looking handsome in your drawing?" Keller responded, "No, human." Jim chuckled and offered him a cigarette. This developed into a customary exchange. One would create art, the other would hum a melody, neither fully recognized. By April of 1945, news seeped into the compound like a breeze through the mesh. Berlin was besieged. Hitler remained silent, the Reich disintegrating into mere detritus. The men listened, clustered around the radio in a state of stunned silence, their gazes fixed upon the ground. For years, they had been assured of Germany's invincibility and perpetuity. Now, it sounded like a narrative recounted by weary individuals to themselves. Some offered subdued cheers at the mention of capitulation, others turned away, their faces etched with shame. Wattenberg stood in his barracks doorway, his shoulders burdened, the desert sun bleaching his once proud uniform to a dull, muted brown. "It's concluded," he murmured, "and I am uncertain of its implications." That night, the Americans ignited lanterns around the camp and extended an invitation to the prisoners for a modest assembly. It was not a commemoration of victory, but rather a gesture of amity. A few guards brought stringed instruments. Someone prepared coffee with an intensity that could bring tears to the eyes. Keller sat beside Jim, who poured him a mug and remarked, "You'll be returning home shortly, my friend." Keller gazed into the dark liquid, contemplating the current meaning of home. A homeland he no longer recognized. Cities reduced to ashes. A family potentially lost. "Do you believe they will credit our accounts?" he inquired. Jim's brow furrowed. "Regarding what?" "Regarding your kindness." The following morning, the camp's flagpole stood devoid of any banner. The German detainees, without any prompting, hoisted a white bedsheet to half-mast. No one uttered the word surrender, yet it was palpable in the atmosphere, tender and weighty. The Americans rendered a silent salute. In that singular instant, the war concluded. Not through a treaty, not within the confines of Berlin, but here, in a tranquil desert where individuals once considered enemies had shared cigarettes and melodies. Weeks elapsed. Trucks began to arrive, transporting men northward, back towards ports where vessels awaited. Keller observed as group after group departed, waving through the wire until the dust obscured them. When his turn arrived, he gathered his meager possessions, the sketchbook, a small harmonica, and a missive from Jim that simply read, "You were a commendable prisoner and an even finer man." He folded it meticulously and placed it within his shirt pocket. As the convoy departed Camp Papago, the landscape stretched out infinitely, flat plains shimmering with heat, interspersed with the very cacti and sand that had once felt like punishment. Keller peered out the window and reflected on the tunnel, on Wattenberg's unyielding pride, and on the farmers who had offered them sustenance instead of projectiles. He then comprehended that liberty assumed numerous forms, one fashioned from wire, another from compassion. Both possessed the power to shape a person eternally. The vessel homeward traversed a calmer ocean than the one that had conveyed them to this place. The repatriated individuals slumbered beneath American blankets, partook of American cuisine, and watched the horizon brighten with each successive dawn. Upon their arrival in Europe, they were met not with a homecoming, but with an unsettling quietude. Germany lay in ruins, its cities despoiled, its populace emaciated. Some civilians cast accusations at returning soldiers, labeling them cowards for having survived while others perished. Keller wandered through the devastation of Bremen and located the street where his mother's residence had once stood. Nothing remained but fragments of brick and cherished recollections. He opened his sketchbook amidst the wreckage and depicted the desert, the palm trees, the guard towers, a man named Jim, smiling with a cigarette. Beneath it, he inscribed in small lettering, "Papago heaven compared to the East." It was not sarcasm, it was profound gratitude. He now understood that survival itself had been an act of providence and that compassion could be as transformative as any military force. Years later, once an era of peace had settled across the globe, Keller would recount his experiences at that peculiar encampment in Arizona to his grandson. He never delved into matters of ideology or defeat, focusing solely on the day he learned that empathy was not a sign of weakness, and that inherent dignity could transcend even the grandest empires. "They provided us with meat on Sundays, warm water, and music," he would remark. "They afforded us the opportunity to feel human once more. That was their triumph." Back in Arizona, the desert gradually reclaimed what humanity had constructed. The camp was dismantled. Its timber was repurposed for the construction of dwellings. The metal fences were melted down to forge implements. Only the foundation of the mess hall remained, partially submerged in sand. Occasionally, hikers traversing Papago Park would stumble upon this remnant and ponder the stories that had unfolded there. How individuals once deemed enemies had discovered something sacred amidst their confinement. If one stood there at sunset, a faint echo of laughter, the clinking of tin cups, and the distant hum of a harmonica could still be perceived. And if one listened attentively, the desert seemed to whisper the sentiment that Keller had once penned. "Mercy is the memory that endures beyond all conflict." Therefore, when individuals inquired about Camp Papago in the subsequent years, he would offer a faint smile and reply, "It was paradise compared to the Eastern Front." Then, after a brief pause, he would add, "And perhaps, for a fleeting period, it was indeed paradise."